Last thing Jonah remembered was hitting the water, hearing the call that a whale was coming, and seeing total black. What he didn't realize was that the captain and the sailors were all in a panic because they were sure that the whale had swallowed Jonah. Little did they know that that was exactly what had happened. But the moment that Jonah hit the ocean waves, everything stopped. It was still. No one could believe it. It was the first time that they had ever seen something so strange and so miraculous that all that they could do was to start worshiping the God that Jonah followed, or the God that Jonah said that he followed. They thanked him, they praised him, and when they got back home, both them and their families started worshiping God. But here Jonah was sitting in the stomach of a whale, not sure what to do, knowing that there was going to be days and nights that he would be just sitting there pondering what he had done and how he had done wrong, and even more, the very fact that he should have served God from the start and done what God had said would have been a lot better for him. But what he didn't understand was what he was going through was exactly in God's plan. Might sound familiar to some of us. But as Jonah sat there and he was thinking through the different things that he had done for God and the different things that God had done through him, Jonah started to pray again. Jonah knew that there was nothing that he could do but pray. And so in the midst of that darkness, he started talking to God. For a long time it felt as though he was talking to himself and sharing his emotions, and even more, crying out to God with tears going down his cheeks. What he didn't realize is that God was listening. God was right there with him, and God was speaking to him, just Jonah wasn't ready to listen. A day went by, 2 days went by, 3 days went by. And Jonah just sat there, complaining more than trying to listen, pouring his heart and soul out to God, and then thinking about his family and his wife and what the nation of Israel must be doing, and then sadness that he hadn't been doing what God had asked him to do. But then even he started wondering, how many people, even myself, do this on a daily basis and we don't even think about what God is calling us to do. Then he starts to pray again and starts to quote different things from passages that he had read over the years, reminding himself about how God continued to work, and even more that he caused the problems that he did. But every time that he thought about these problems and how he was running away trying to get to Tarshish, always came back to his mind, I caused this myself. I'm the reason why this is happening and why I'm in the darkness of this large whale or fish or whatever it might be. Jonah, as he was sitting there thinking about this, didn't realize that this whale was on its way to the shores outside of Nineveh. But he also didn't realize that this very whale or fish or whatever it could be was the exact creature that the Ninevites actually worshipped. And Jonah had to be swallowed so that he would be able to do the work that God had called him to do. That happens to us a lot, doesn't it? Where God calls us to something, and sometimes it takes something greater happening in order for us to do what God has asked us to do. But Jonah sat there and he was pondering and marveling, and more tears went down his cheeks, thinking about how he had gone against God's will and gone against the very thing that God had asked him to do. Finally, the afternoon of day 3, Jonah realized that he had been complaining so much and hadn't been listening. So he stopped and he said, God, I'm so sorry. I've been complaining this whole time and I haven't been listening to what you've been trying to tell me. And the next thing he knew was he heard God chuckle and they started talking. Jonah realized that even in his life and the life of others, sometimes things happen and they go longer than expected because we're not listening to what God has to say. Jonah laughs deeply and says to himself, this is something I'm going to have to tell others when I finally get back home. Little did he realize that this trip was a one-way trip and he was never going to be going home. But he didn't know that at the time, and God didn't say anything about it. But the next thing he knew is God said, hey, hold on. The next thing you're going to realize is you're going to be out of this. Jonah kind of stopped, and he was expecting that eventually the whale was just going to digest him, and that was the end of Jonah, the prophet of Israel. But he kept forgetting that God had a bigger plan for his life. Next thing he realizes is that the whale goes above the waves and Jonah sees daylight once again, except not in the way that he was expecting. The whale got up speed and got up enough momentum to be able to spit him out long distance from shore. Jonah got spit out and he looked down and he could see the waves pounding against the sand, and he realized, I'm going to land in that sand in just a moment. So he tried to brace himself the best that he could to make sure he didn't get hurt, and next thing he felt was that he went into the sand and everything went black. A couple hours later, he woke up to see the sunrise and see someone standing over him. What he didn't realize is that it was Jesus himself, standing there waiting for Jonah to wake up and get ready for sending him back on what he was supposed to do. Jonah woke up and Jesus helped him to his feet and gave him something to eat and said, okay, I've told you once, I've told you twice. I'm realizing sometimes it's going to take you 3 times to realize what you're going to need to do. So once again, here's your instructions. What you need to do is you need to go to the town of Nineveh in the country of Assyria, and you need to tell them and their king that if they don't repent, they're going to die. Not only are they going to die, but their whole city is going to be destroyed fully by fire itself. Jonah looked very concerned and not sure what to do, scratched his head and said, well, if that's what you're saying, okay. Back of his mind thinking that, well, if I turn around really fast, maybe I can run on water to Tarshish. Just as he gets ready to turn, all of a sudden he sees the whale top over the waves and goes, well, never mind. I'm not going to have another one of those rides. Maybe it's time to actually do what God is asking me to do. So Jonah falls on his knees before Jesus and says, I'm sorry. You were right. I was wrong. I'm ready to do what you've asked me to do. Jesus smiles and gave the instructions once again and said, okay, you know where you need to go. Here's some food for your journey. And he points in the direction of where Nineveh was, which Jonah knew that because he didn't do what was right the first time, this was going to be a much longer journey. Probably could have been 2 to 3 days that he would have to walk. But that was 2 or 3 days that he was going to need in order to be ready for what was to come. So little did Jonah know, little did he know, little did he understand that what was about to happen would puzzle his mind greatly, and that God still had mercy on a people and a group that he thought should be destroyed. But we're almost like Jonah with this, aren't we? Where too often God asks us to do things, and we'd rather go the other way and say, well, no, you can go and destroy them, but I'm not going to do this. Maybe we need to have a land fish or a fish in water to swallow us so that we're actually doing what God has asked us to do. So that, just like with Jonah, sometimes we need to walk a couple days realizing what God is going to do and how he's going to use us. The more that Jonah walked, the more that he realized that he needed to do what God called him to do. And the only question that kept going through his mind was this: I know that God has called me to this, but will I ever see my home again?